Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Experience, Expectations, and Exploration Virtual Learning with Derek. I'm so excited to have Derek here presenting and sharing with Quizlet teachers and the Quizlet community. And so with further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Derek.
Thanks so much, Chad. Welcome, everybody. I can see there are people coming in from all over the globe, which is real exciting to see. Hopefully you guys will be able to glean something off of this that is useful to you. I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and then I'll launch into the presentation. So as you can see from the title, it's sort of broken down into these three different parts. It's going to be heavily focused on my personal experience with virtual learning. Maybe some of you guys can relate to that. And then take a look at some avenues of exploration around virtual learning. And then how do we set expectations with this upcoming academic year? Now, I'm going to start off with a little bit of an icebreaker here, and I know it might be difficult for you guys to respond, but I do want you thinking about this question. And I don't want it to be academic related. I want it to be something separate. How is it that you recognize students for their individuality or celebrated them for being themselves? So I'll give you all a chance to think about that. If you want to type it into the chat box, feel free to do so. But it's an important question. So go ahead and take 20 seconds and think about this. So I'm getting some wonderful answers, and it's just a chance for you to personally reflect it. Not essentially an icebreaker in the way that I thought we could do it, but we'll come back to that a little bit later on. I want to take you to a new question. Can you answer this one? Maybe you could throw it in the chat box. Some pretty good responses there. Let me go ahead and reveal to you the answer. As you can see, back in 1977, NASA Voyager was launched, and in 1990, it reached the outer edges of the solar system. It turned around and snapped a photograph of our planet, as you can see in this previous slide. Really fascinating to see planet Earth from that distance. Now, one more question. What else was launched in 1977? Got some ideas going on in your head? Every time I ask my students that, Star Wars always comes up. But the correct answer I'm looking for is me. My birthday is July 3rd, 1977. And every single start to the academic year and every single academic class, I always do this activity. Why? I want to share with them a little bit of my personal side, because I'm going to ask them for their birthdays. And then it connects back to the icebreaker. The reason why I do it is because I put their birthdays in chronological order, and as we go through the academic year, we celebrate every single birthday. We sing a happy birthday song, we clap and we cheer for them, and I write them a handwritten happy birthday card. And so it's important to find a way to connect with your students. In person, that was my thing, and it became one of the vital things that we hung on to in the virtual realm, able to celebrate birthdays. They really look forward to that. And so I encourage you guys to think about how you might be able to individually connect with your students and celebrate them for being themselves. All right, as the title suggested, we're going to be talking a little bit about experience in the virtual world. Before I do that, I want to give you a little bit of my background so you know where I'm coming from. As you guys read through this, there's some really awesome comments that you guys are making, and I'm so excited to see that so many of you do something very similar. I have over 18 years of experience, mostly in-person teaching. And currently, I'm working at the Fame High School here in New York City, teaching environmental science. So if you've ever seen the movie, you know the kinds of students that attend this school. Yes, spoiler up for all those alumni out there. Now, I'll begin by talking about my personal experience with virtual learning. If you take a look at this slide, you will see I selected an image. I was very deliberate about that image, and maybe this image makes sense to you because you felt the same way too. To help paint this picture, I want to talk about the timeline of virtual learning. So if you allow me to run through that quickly. Ominously, on Friday the 13th, it was the last day I saw my students. And at that point, about half of the students were showing up. So it was this weird feeling of what is going to happen. Well, we soon find out on that Sunday evening that we were going to be resuming school virtually. And we took a week off where teachers reported to their school and discussed how this virtual experience was going to unfold. Now that Tuesday was pretty chaotic, and I'm sure you can relate when you were told that you had to do something similar. Teachers were scrambling to figure out what's the format we're going to use, how is education going to look, a lot of questions. Then once virtual learning started, it was kind of chaotic, at least for me. That first day on March 22nd, I had over 90 students log on to Google Meets. And so I had 90 little frames staring back at me and no real protocol for how to engage with them. So I had kids talking over each other and they were clamoring to see how each other were doing. So it was a bit overwhelming to say the least. And I'm sure many of you have experienced something similar. This was the overwhelming feeling I had going into virtual learning. Some of you are saying it was very similar. I felt in the dark. I couldn't connect with my colleagues. I couldn't see my students in the same way. And there were so many social cues that we pick up on that were just gone. So it felt like I was missing a couple of senses here as we began this journey. And I want to talk a little bit about reimagining the course, the classroom experience. It took me some time to figure out how I was going to engage, but essentially, it looked something like this. We were already using Google Classroom throughout the year. As an environmental science teacher, I wanted to reduce paper load, and so I was assigning things virtually, and they were submitting things virtually. So we were okay with that. But we had to decide on a format to video chat, and we selected Google Meets as a staff. And what I decided to do was to post the entire week ahead of time in outline format so the students kind of got a sense of what was coming. Then I offered 3 times a day meeting sessions where we could video chat with each other. Now, after about a couple of days, I reduced that to 2 options because it was just exhausting. And then I used what's called Model A. I'll explain that later, but that's kind of what virtual learning looked like for me. Now, as I got into virtual learning, I still felt in the dark, but there was a new feeling that emerged. I was breaking down walls that I wasn't used to seeing beyond. Now, I'm sure some of you had similar experiences. So for instance, I was able to take a peek at students' bedrooms. I'd never in my life seen something like that. I saw family members. They were bringing in younger siblings or parents into the virtual space. They even brought in their pets, and so they became a part of the classroom. And so it really became this intimate experience. Now, I'm sure some of you guys have something very similar where you start to see your students in a different light. You also get a sense of what they were dealing with. I had some students who literally had to Zoom chat in their bathroom because they lived in tiny apartments here in New York City, and their siblings were on another call in another room, and they had no space for it. And so I had to figure out how to accommodate all of those different needs fairly quickly. And what I learned is that we were both lifelines for each other. The students were a lifeline for me. Sticking in a studio apartment alone in New York City wasn't an easy thing, and so connecting with them was a lifeline, and vice versa. They were I was a lifeline for them. Being able to connect with their peers and chat with each other was helpful in this really difficult stage that we were all experiencing. As you can read through some of these comments here, many of you got an intimate experience with your students very similarly. You know, comments are reading very similar type of lines that I just gave you. And so I wanted to focus in on how I could best support my students, not just with content, but just helping them through this difficult time. So I quickly decided to break it up into 3 categories. It seemed to me like the students needed some type of emotional support. They also needed mental check-ins. They needed to be challenged, but they also needed to de-stress because a lot of tension was building up. And then they also needed some type of organizational structure. And so I want to talk about each of these and kind of give you an idea of how I approached it in this last semester. I talked a bit about Model A. Well, this is what Model A looked like. As you can see, at the end of the week, I would post the sort of upcoming week on Google Classroom. So they kind of knew what that was going to look like. And then daily, the students had a list of assignments and resources that they had to complete. Also daily in the virtual sessions, we checked in with each other to make sure whatever the previous day contained, they understood, like they were making connections and they felt comfortable with it. So it was meeting daily, but their task that they had to do was always done a day before the virtual session, so that when they were in the virtual session, we were discussing whatever the assignment was for the day before. We also laid out some due dates for them, just to make sure that they were exposing themselves to this content, that they were completing these graphic organizers, excuse me, and that they were being submitted for credit. Now, those due dates had soft deadlines, of course, because students were dealing with so much, and I called them checkpoints. So let's take a look at a little bit more detail in that organizational piece. I mentioned that I would post the week ahead, and so it would be detailed. Each day laid out the learning objective. It laid out resources that I wanted them to read or view, and it gave them an idea of the essential knowledge that they need to pull out from those resources. Then on the following day or the next day, they could log on to any one of these sessions to talk about those resources, and I would facilitate that discussion. And then, as you can see, there was a checkpoint that needed to be submitted on a designated day that kind of took a look at all of the lessons around a topic, and it gave me a chance to assess them. The checkpoints were pretty much simple. They were basic graphic organizers. And so when we were discussing the resources from the previous day, I would say to them, all right, so you guys looked at these resources and we were talking about mining operations. We learned about the term ore, and I'd ask them to tell me what they found out. And then we would agree that that was the definition, and so they felt comfortable moving on. And so the lesson wasn't me teaching in the same way. It was more of a discussion about the previous day's resources to make sure that they understood. Now, I had about 5 classes. In each class had about 34 students. And so that totaled to about 170 students. But on any given day, only about 50 of my students were showing up to the virtual sessions. So I had to feel some confidence that they didn't have questions and didn't need that virtual session. It was a limitation of this last semester, and I'm sure this new academic year will look different, but it is the way that this previous semester unfolded. That was the organizational structure that I provided them. But I quickly realized that there were some other pieces that I needed to address. The mental support, they needed a place to de-stress. They were being challenged with content and they were being stressed out with their situation. And so what I decided to do was incorporate some mental games to take their mind off of everything they were going through, whether it be academic or pandemic. And so I started the class with little things like Quizlet games or Quizlet reviews or Kahoot games, Sporkle trivia, or scribble drawings. And it was only about 5 or 10 minutes, but it allowed for them just to engage in a way that was different than the usual. And then I recognized there's a whole emotional piece that I needed to help them with. As you know, the New York City area was hit hard by the pandemic. And so we had in those early days, lots of infection, and we even had some death within the school community. So we needed to address that. We also had fears about what was coming ahead. And then in May, we all know that racial issues really came to the forefront of our conversation. And so we needed to have space for that as well. So I incorporated a question of the day to provide them with their emotional support. So for instance, as you can see, I would pose a question to the class at the end of the period to say, share one thing that you're concerned about once the quarantine or pandemic is over. And it was really interesting to hear what they were thinking. Many students were concerned about local community businesses and whether or not they would be able to survive. Many were fearful that this virtual learning space would just continue, and they didn't want that. So it's interesting to give them that chance to talk a little bit about their fears and concerns. And then when we had some real pressing issues come out in May and June around race in the United States, I felt it was important for these young adults to have a forum to discuss this. And so questions turned into personal experiences of life in America and figuratively giving the mic over to students to talk about that. So it really became an opportunity for students to connect with one another, to socialize, because they weren't getting that. And so the virtual lesson looked like this. It would start off with some sort of mental check-in. We play a game, decompress a little bit. Then we got into the organizational piece where we talked about the content to make sure that they were solid. And then we addressed the emotional side, talking about some of those issues they were grappling with. And what I learned with content, less is more. There was so much other elements that I needed to address besides the content. The second part of this presentation is exploration. And so I presented what was Model A, but there's Model B, C, D, E, and so on. And what I'm looking to explore in the new semester of virtual learning is taking a look at case studies. How would I present case studies to class in a virtual setting? Or having the students create presentations around topics and then present them in the virtual space. There's a possibility of creating breakout rooms now that we are able to use Zoom and having small group discussions in those breakout rooms. I also was thinking about doing one-on-one interviews with students because unlike the previous year, I'm not going to have a relationship with my current students and then launch into virtual. It's going to be reversed. I'm going to be launching into virtual and then having to build a relationship. I'm also hoping to do recordings that I can just post as resources so that it is a much more targeted viewing for the students. And I've also thought about bringing in guest speakers. There are lots of resources out there that we could tap into in this virtual world. And so I encourage you guys, if you have ideas that you're interested in exploring, to sort of jot them into the chat box there, because be nice to share out those things. I recognize in all of this that there needs to be an element of support for teachers. We can't go out this alone. So what I've discovered is that we need to be reaching out to each other, which we're already doing. If you look at the space that Quizlet has provided, it is an opportunity for teachers around the globe to connect with one another and share out ideas, and just know that you're not alone in this experience. It's also an opportunity just to explore and have a new outlook on education. This pandemic has silver linings, and one of them could be a new approach to education. And you're doing that by joining Quizlet and going to these sessions. You're starting to explore new and creative ways. You also have to set boundaries for yourself. And I encourage you to share those boundaries with other people, because sometimes people need to hear that other people are doing that so that they can instill those boundaries. And sometimes you need to check to make sure the boundaries you're setting are not absurd, that they're reasonable, because boundaries are important. And finally, I teach AP Environmental Science, and what we learn right off the bat is that the key to survival for any species is to be adaptable. And that holds true for us. We have experienced an environmental stress here, and the ones who are going to thrive in this are the ones who are quick to adapt. And the fact that you're joining this Quizlet conference is an indication that you are ready and willing to adapt. And so I applaud you guys for joining this session today. I want to end the talk on experience, exploration, and expectations in virtual learning with this thought I had this past weekend as I was summiting Mount Washington. I've looked at virtual learning as if it were this hike, this trek. And I want you to take a second and read through the text here. I've color-coded it. And I want you to think about what each color is really paralleling in the virtual world. So if you take a look at the red part, we know that we are going to have to enter a new virtual space in the new semester. It seems inevitable for so many of us. And there's not many road signs. There's a trail, but it is covered up with lots of debris there that we kind of have to faintly make out. So there are some markers, but don't be fooled. This is going to be difficult to plow through. That's what we see in the purple. And finally, in the blue, we start to see how we can get there. Over the summer, make sure you're packing your sack with all the necessary tools. Make sure that you're able to pull those out, and that you're adaptable and ready to go with those new tools. And finally, as anyone who's hiked before, it's not wise to do it alone. Bring others with you, and this is what Quizlet has offered you. And so I just wanted to thank Quizlet for the opportunity, and thank you for joining on this virtual journey. So if you guys have questions, please feel free to raise them now.
Great, and then Derek, I will help you moderate the questions. If teachers submit them in the Q&A tool on the bottom, I will ask them, and if you're tuning in from YouTube Live, for sure add questions to the live chat. And again, Derek, thank you so much for sharing this and presenting. You can see so many teachers are inspired and thanking you in the chat session now. And so I will look through the questions. And the first one for you, Derek, is how did you do summer birthdays? Because as an August girl, I always felt neglected.
That's a good question. As you know from the start, I have a summer birthday as well. And so towards the end of the school year, we made sure that we listed all of those students who wouldn't have a chance to connect virtually on their birthday.
And then to follow up with that, another teacher asks, do you celebrate the birthdays of students who do not want to be called out? I do birthdays, and have birthdays for summer students, but not all students enjoy the attention.
Yeah, it's always tricky with that. Some students do shy away from it, but if that's the case, I always make it a point to give them a birthday card. So I slide it on their desk. So even if they don't want the hoopla around it, they get some sort of recognition that they're important.
That's great. Another question for you, I think a lot of teachers are wondering with remote learning, and you gave such a inspirational accounting of what you do. So for one teacher in particular, it's anonymous. This teacher asks, how did you accommodate students who had time conflicts with responsibilities to other courses in your school?
Yeah, so that was a big issue for many of us. The lines of communication need to be open, and fortunately we still had email available to us. And so in Google Classroom, in the virtual space, I always said, if you need extensions on assignments, if you need to set up a separate office hour, please directly contact me. So there was always that direct line of communication for that.
And something I think too, Derek, that a lot of teachers are popping up in the Q&A tool is it's so not uniform, right? Different schools and different districts, different states, it's all over the place with requirements. And so Karen asks, did you track attendance for online class attendance or have any consequences for students that didn't attend?
So the guidelines based on the Department of Education was to make sure that you had some way of recognizing that the students were being exposed to the content and you could grade them for completing that. And so when I started to notice after the deadlines were rolling that students were not submitting that, or if they had not been appearing in the virtual space, I sort of listed those students and then wrote emails, waited for a response. And if I didn't get a response via email, then I made phone calls home. The list ended up being around 50 students for emails. And then that dwindled down to about 10 phone calls that I had to make. So there were different tiers of contact.
And then to follow up with that, how many of your students turned in work on time?
Yeah, so it's very similar. Like if I wasn't getting students submitting, that's when I would then reach out by email. And that ended up being around 50 students, which I teach about 170. So it gives you a sense of what the breakdown was. There was a lot of attention on content in those early days because we were prepping for an AP exam that was still going to happen. And I did hold review sessions, but it all still kept in the format of, you know, the mental check-in, the organizational check-in, and then the emotional check-in. And when they weren't submitting, that's when I reached out.
And then taking it back to the the experience part of your presentation, a teacher asks, for the emotional support part, did the students share verbally or through typing? Was there enough time for all students to share?
Yeah, so the sessions were about 45 minutes. There were days where it went over, particularly on the days where we were letting students have a voice about their personal experiences in America. Some students were able to openly express that in the virtual space. Some students were able to write that out in emails to me. A number of students wrote, I didn't say much in class today, but I was paying attention and I really appreciate, you know, hearing from these students. So thank you for letting, you know, that take place. So it was a combination of both.
And then a follow-up question to that, Derek, we're asking all presenters, everything will be recorded and put onto the Quizlet YouTube channel after the unconference. Are you open to sharing your slides with the audience?
Yeah, absolutely, for sure.
Great. Another question then, with your explanations of like using model A, etc. Have you developed the other models, B, C, D?
It's a good question. I've had some experience this summer. I'm working with a group of high school students and college students at Columbia University. We had to revamp our summer research program. And what we're doing is creating these little modules, these 2-week modules around topics like environmental activism. And so that has lent itself to bringing case studies, bringing guest speakers. And I've been using that as sort of like experimental ground for creating that in my content for next semester.
And then Derek, a teacher asked to follow up to that. Could we see the Model A outline again, please and thank you?
Sure. So if you just take a look here, you post the outline for the week ahead, which looks like this. This is just one day of that. And it has resources, the office hours, and the due dates. And then each day we would, well, the students would have to complete the resources. So if you look at this resource column, they were working on this on Tuesday, but then that office hour on Tuesday was discussing the resources from Monday.
And then oh, sorry.
The checkpoint had a due date, yeah.
And then Derek, sorry to make you swipe between the slides. Another teacher asks, what did the colors mean in your final quote? Sorry, I missed it.
Yeah, sure. So, oops, let me go back to that. So it just broke it up. Like the red part, the DOE is trying really hard to give us some guidelines about what to expect, but it just seems faint, and we don't know for sure, like, is this the path, or does it turn left, or do we go right here? So it's just kind of getting this idea of like, there's kind of a path to follow, but it's not clear. The purple is, you know, even though the markers are there, we know that this is going to be a difficult trek. It's not going to be an easy thing. And the blue is just, well, then how do we carry this burden? How do we trek through this? And it's to make sure that you have the supplies that you need and don't go it alone.
Well, and then Derek, just being conscious of time, I'll give you another 5 minutes of questions if that's okay with you. We have a lot of questions pouring in.
Yeah.
Great. So to follow up on that, right, they're flooding in, so I'm trying to read them and stop the questions from cycling. When students completely disappeared from class, or if any, how did you re-engage them or reach out to them?
That's a good question. That's so many teachers were grappling with that. And it wasn't like, unfortunately, we could catch all. So when we did encounter students who seemed to be, you know, disengaged, reaching out email, reaching out phone, and going as far as setting up one-on-one sessions to find out what's really going on, why they haven't been submitting, and what kind of accommodations they might need. That's probably the best thing I could recommend. And I know it's very taxing to do that, but the return for those individual students is pretty great.
And then to build off of that, you mentioned you're an AP environmental science teacher. What was preparing your students for the AP exam like, and how did they do, if you know?
Yeah, that was pretty difficult, to be honest, because they revised the entire test, and there was a lot of questions that they had that I didn't necessarily feel confident to answer, like what happens if they go over the time, or, you know, like, could they type in this particular format and send it this way? So it was very, very daunting of a task. And I just kind of pulled in like as many resources as possible. I talked to other AP teachers. I actually, you know, I was asking students, like, what did you learn? So we were just kind of collectively bringing all of our resources together to try to figure it out. And there was lots of feedback post the exam that we were able to give each other. So that's kind of how we muddled our way through it.
And then following up to that, what do labs look like in virtual teaching?
Very, very difficult to incorporate those this year. And so that's going to be one thing that we need to look at in the exploration part for next year. How do we incorporate research and lab activities in the virtual space? I don't have a correct answer for that, but I know there has to be some way to do that. And so that's what I would encourage people to do in the summertime, is explore ways and talk to other people about what they've done.
Right, and I think that's kind of the common thread right now, right, Derek, that there is no set answer yet and everyone's trying to learn. And on that note, here's the question of the day. I'm sure many teachers in these sessions can offer an answer to this question. We have a brand new teacher who asked you, any advice to the brand new teachers like me who are just starting to teach?
Oh, wow. Good luck. I think that you are in a very unique situation. I would focus heavily on how do you build relationships and understanding that less is more with content sometimes when we are looking at this unique situation.
And then Derek, we have time for like 3 more questions. So I will wipe through that real quick. On that inspirational note, you're getting a huge shout out for the way that you've supported students with their emotional well-being and checking in. And a lot of teachers loved the Lifeline comment analogy that you made. And so in particular, did you have any exact experience with supporting students who had mental health issues that were not engaged? And even though you reached out, it was just difficult to support in a virtual environment?
Yes. Unfortunately, there were a number, I would probably say around 2, 3 students where we couldn't catch them in the time frame of the semester. And so we had to give them what's been sort of like a no credit. It's not a pass, it's not a fail, it's a no credit. And then we're going to continue to reach out over the summer, but more likely in the new academic year to kind of recuperate some of those assignments that they weren't able to complete because of extenuating circumstances. So it's a very small number, but that's sort of the plan to sort of catch them before they graduate.
Cool. And then we'll end, Derek, on the final question of how did you deal with assessments and cheating in the virtual learning environment?
Yeah, so tests had to change, and I wasn't necessarily upset by that change because in the real world, we're never told to go into a room by yourself and to answer these questions. In the real world, when we're confronted with a problem, we could talk to peers, we can look things up. And so it was an opportunity for me to say, hey, collaboration is okay. Hey, you can look these things up, but make sure that you are attempting this on your own. And so in this space, this virtual space, I went ahead and gave similar tests, but I told them, look, you can tap into resources. And fortunately, that's the way the sort of AP College Board saw it. They allowed students to use resources on the AP exam. So it was kind of a model set in place for them for that test.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Derek. Thank you so much for this presentation, inspiring our teachers, taking time out of your day. To those attending, I forgot to mention at the beginning, Derek was the Quizlet Teacher Appreciation winner from May earlier in the year. So thank you so much for joining to participate. That's how we originally connected. And then to all the other teachers attending right now, our next session is What's Next for Teachers, and we're going to have a presentation from 3 of our product managers here at Quizlet. That's at 11:25 PDT AM. We rearranged the schedule a bit so that we have a little bit of a break now between this session and the next. The originally scheduled lunch break is now going to have Quizlet 101 and intro. And so if you can join, I hope to see everyone there. But in the meantime, take these 20 minutes and we'll see everyone for the next session. Again, thank you so much, Derek. We'll be in touch.
Thank you guys for all joining. Appreciate it.
And then Derek, do you have any online social media or branding that you want to share with our teachers to follow you or to be in touch?
Unfortunately, I don't have an online social media present, but I teach at LaGuardia High School, and feel free to contact me if you have any further questions.
Right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, and then see everyone in 20 minutes. Thank you, Derek.
Thank you. Bye-bye.